Welcome back to SideQuest, episode 29, Final Fantasy VII, episode 17. And with a heavy, heavy heart, I welcome you, my esteemed colleague, Mr. Wesley Schantz, to this very, very sad denouement of Disc 1 in Final Fantasy VII. Welcome back, Mr. Wesley.
Ooh, thanks. I would say I'm happy to be here, but I know that it is a sad moment as we bid adieu to Eris. It's been with us since the very start of the game. She's like the first thing you see when you start the game, right? I noticed something this time actually. When you have to take the disc out and you put the first disc back in your little box, if you're tidy like that, you'll see her image in there too. It's like she's waving goodbye to you. The picture in the little case underneath where the first disc goes is of Eris and the high wind in the background.
Now, see,
Oh, man.
I always like that because what I always thought about when I looked at that later in the game, and I sort of have tingles remembering that, is it's sort of her with her back to the player but watching the high wind, right? And she never sees the high wind with you, right? She never sees you guys in the high wind. And so it sort of like represents to me in sort of a Beatrice Dante way, like an ideal that you must say goodbye to in order to reach new heights. Just to jump immediately into the metaphorical.
Yeah, no, it is such an iconic. There's so many iconic images that cluster around Eris. That's a beautiful one. It makes me think of our side quests with Hayao Miyazaki that we started this project with. I find that of the Eris images, her face there beside the Mako spilling out in the alleyway is probably the one that is the most, I don't know, evocative. We talked about that earlier in this series, but I know for a lot of people, the death scene is like the key moment of their video gaming lives. They're playing of this game and maybe of all the games that they play, right? And the impact that it has on people's psyche is really, really interesting. For me, it was always, surprising, shocking. Yeah, sure. But I still feel like her life and her, what she represents is a lot more than that to kind of read the game more holistically. I feel, at least. But the death is
especially if you're taking the frame of Cloud very seriously right now. Sephiroth has always been that sort of big brother figure, that ideal figure that you can't live up to, who you're finally taking a crack at. And so now he pulls the ultimate big brother move, which is to take something away from you, which is extremely important to you. And even in the moment of its death, has sort of genuine general importance too, making it all the more tragic that she, who in the beginning was a simple metaphor for, natural beauty existing alongside sort of artificial, sort of like garbage, right? Like sort of, she was herself a garden within the trash heap of Midgard, showing that something beautiful or pure could exist. And then Sephiroth says, nope, taking that from you too. You don't have, and so like now, I mean, if you just stack up with Cloud, Sephiroth has taken his family from him, his hometown, he is the hero that Cloud could never become, and now has taken sort of his girlfriend from him too, who he was starting to idealize a future from, and just also shown Cloud how powerless he is, not only to control his own self, but to control the fates of those around him. He's like the opposite of a responsible, successful man, right? Like a Mufasa character. He's like a young Simba. Everything that's happening around him, he cannot control. He can't even control himself. He can't get it together. And actually, I did want to talk about that a little. The fact that he loses control again and almost kills Ares, while you sort of have weird control of him. And then Sephiroth comes down and strikes her down. And I was sort of trying to read that metaphorically as if, Cloud, Sephiroth does this through the actions of Cloud. But it does also seem significant that he did hold up at the last moment, though. Red 13 and Barrett, who are on my team right now, are really looking at him with some serious suspicion. In fact, Barrett, slightly earlier, when Cloud was like, will you guys follow me? He was like, I don't know, man, which was a pretty lukewarm answer. But yeah, I wanted to sort of unpack that scene, that monumental scene where we get, one of the rare and incredible CGIs and, one of the best.
Yeah, it struck me this time. Yeah, I didn't remember much about that part where you are the in control of Cloud, but all that you can do is lift the sword, right? You can move the controller around and he'll sort of resist and struggle, but he's rooted to the spot. The sword appears in his hand. He raises it over his head, and then the only thing you can do, if you want to proceed with the game, you've got to push the button that would be the strike. And then the two party members, whoever they are, will cry out in that moment, and he'll sort of snap out of it. And I have to imagine that is actually Sephiroth releasing him, because I don't see that their intervention would be enough,
Right.
So like getting into the actual fine points of it, you can read it a few different ways, right? You can say, okay, Cloud overcomes Sephiroth's control in that key moment. That's one way to read it. You could read it like an Abraham Isaac thing, where in the final moment, an angel, so to speak, stays his hand, something bigger than him that intervenes in the final moment. And maybe that's, Aeris and her holy sort of aura, and the life stream and this and that, right? Like maybe you could look at it that way. They intervene there. That force comes in that moment. And maybe that's even like a more interesting way to think about it. And Sephiroth only thinks that he's released Cloud, but he's actually caught in a bigger destiny than even Sephiroth understands. That's, a possibility. But the simplest, the Occam's razor thing here, I think would lead you to conclude that, yes, Sephiroth has sadistically released Cloud in the moment when he realizes that he could have forced him to kill Aeris, but Sephiroth would rather do it himself, right in front of Cloud, and have Cloud be powerless to stop him, and know that he was just about to be forced to do it himself. And in some way, he has failed. Like you're saying, he's failed to live up to the role that he had set for himself, that he had identified with and believed was his calling, right, of this kind of great hero, that Sephiroth himself has completely betrayed the ideal that Cloud had of him, and that now this new ideal of Aeris, right, is taken away, is impaled from behind with the sword of his previous ideal, and she falls. And in that moment, the holy materia is released from her ribbon, right, and it bounces. It defies gravity and physics and bounces in the pattern that Cloud had jumped to reach that pedestal in the middle of the water. It falls in the water, as Cloud will later release Aeris into the water. So there's just a lot of interesting echoes and things going on there. What else did you notice, or what do you think about that scene?
Well, and so that then literally something holy is lost in that moment, because the materia holy is lost. And I want to focus on something Sephiroth starts to say and Genova then says, which is, you are just a puppet. Because Cloud, that sort of has implications for how we read him throughout the entirety of the first disc, because he did actually give the black materia to Sephiroth. He did actually recruit sort of Ares to come with him in the first place. And because of him giving the black materia to Sephiroth, Ares then came to this temple, and then he followed her, which enabled Sephiroth to follow her, though we're not exactly sure how that works, but it seems to be sort of like a Voldemort inside Harry's head, sort of occlumency trick, right? That like what Cloud knows, Sephiroth somehow knows. And so not only did did Cloud give Sephiroth the materia necessary in order to destroy the world. In so doing, he drew Ares to this vulnerable spot, which then allowed Sephiroth, without her knowing, in sort of a et tu, Brute, Caesar, stab her in the back way, then kill her and then move forward without any other ancients to destroy her. Like, Cloud has made all of this possible. And with other clones of Sephiroth or whatever they are, these numbered things, like Red 13, and which share some psychic relationship with Sephiroth, wanting reunion, and you seem to have some psychic relationship with Sephiroth, sort of reminds me also of that sort of trend of video game, like the Metal Gears, where there's always, something underlined and also some psychological sort of, interesting thing, or Silent Hills too. PlayStation seemed to come out with a lot of interesting psychological ideas at this time in its video games, which were interesting to us. But you seem also to be, you do seem, if you read yourself in this way, and this is the interesting thing about playing a video game, right? Do you have any choices, or do you have to follow the same narrative as everybody? And is that way, some way, like what every human's life is, like Shakespeare says about, we're on this ship of merry fools or whatever, and in each his good time we play many roles. I'm paraphrasing, of course, but that has Cloud been totally determined, totally drawn along on a string the entire time? And is that what any hero is, or is that the opposite of a hero? And is it true? Because it has major implications for how we feel right now, because not only do we feel awful because Ares was killed, but now we might also have the additional guilt of it's all our fault. And the world is actually going to now be destroyed because of our foolish quest to try and get Sephiroth. If we had just done nothing, everything would be better than how it is now.
Wow. Yeah, that's like the nihilistic, the most, oh man, yeah. So the puppet thing makes me think of Kate Sith,
yeah,
right? Who's like a very undesirable character in many regards, but one of them is that he's controlled from afar by a Shinra employee, right? It turns out, and so his body is just a puppet. So you're like Kate Sith, right? is what Sephiroth said. And then the other thing it made me think of too, when you're talking about playing many roles, the world is but a stage. That's that scene in the Gold Saucer Date where you go down to play the role of the hero, and whoever you're on the date with plays the role of the princess, and that there's a visual kind of echo of that when you're descending that crystal stair to the castle palace thing at the bottom of the Forgotten City. It looks a lot like the stage that's there in that part of Gold Saucer, and so yeah, and the scene centers on a kind of stage, this platform where Eris is under a beacon, a light shining down on her. It's sort of like almost shining through water is kind of how it looks, right? So it has a very unreal quality, a very staged quality to it. And so if you are a puppet, and that is you following your role in some respects, it becomes a question whether there is anything outside of that. Yeah, whether that is the ultimate reality of the situation, or whether it's one which is being played out for some purpose, right? Like for the entertainment of someone playing a video game, say, or for some more elaborate purpose of the story, of the drama unfolding there between Sephiroth and the ancients, right? The role of those characters, and whether they are in control or whether they are being guided, marionetted, like Cloud seems to be, is a really, I think, a real interesting one to be led to ask here. And I think Eris's passivity in all this is especially strange, and should kind of lead you to ask some questions, I think, about like what does she know in that moment, as she seems to be praying and communing with these spirits, the life stream, the life of the planet. You know,
Yeah,
how much does she kind of clue into levels of reality that are a bit deeper, right? Than what you have access to at this point.
yeah, and that just makes me think two things. One, I want to make the connection between Sephiroth and, say, a superior being or superior culture and its ability to cut through your sort of personal or cultural narrative and make you question the relevance or truth of those potential narratives then, as if Sephiroth is sort of a nihilistic force, or the nihilistic force that could have come post World War II in the wake of, say, a major sort of military defeat, where all of a sudden one questions whether what has one pursued since the narrative one used in order to pursue the ultimate good has failed and ended up in a major cultural military loss. Is this a representation of sort of the spiritual force that eats at a person, that makes them sort of question the fabric of their being, and question the very foundation of their sort of cultural narrative, and even sort of suggest that, with the destruction of Ares, actually a new hope, a new sort of narrative is going to have to be born. And I would suggest that this opinion, or this perspective, is bolstered by the fact that this is an underworld, right? You come through the Bone Village in a forest, a dark forest. That's where Dante goes into the underworld. And the Bone Village, somewhere that's dead, the city of the ancients. It's called both the Forgotten Capital and then the Forgotten City. Somewhere forgotten, where all that which has been which is dead and gone is stored. Sort of the knowledge of those from before. That's the same underworld Odysseus goes into, Aeneas goes into, and that is later sort of figured in a Christian way by Dante. But so this is a place where you even take a light bridge down. So to call it a place of dream or underworld, or a place that is sort of beyond the realm of the normal, that invites metaphorical understanding, I think that's very strong. That something explicitly dramatic is going to happen when you come down those very unreal sort of light stairs. Like you're saying, the stage is quite literally set with light shining down through a water-like medium, indicating that perceptions are blurred. And you are actually beneath the water that you will later bury her in, which is an interesting way to bury someone too, right? It's not burning her; it's like putting her on the fire in like a Star Wars or sort of a Keanu Greek way, or even contemporary American way. But it's dropping her into the water, which is not, that's a sailor's death, I suppose. I'd actually be interested why you think that's the way that it's done.
I wish I had looked that up before this, because as you're saying that, I realized there could be many cultures that actually practice such a burial, but I've never heard of it outside of, as you say, someone dying on board a ship, and then that is the traditional way to lay them to rest. Yeah, and that in itself is quite interesting. If you think about Eris as being a kind of passenger, you're on this journey, right? And she's dying before the journey's over, and so you release her into that medium in which she died. It seems very interesting too that she sinks right away.
Yeah.
Like I always kind of was weirded out by that. It's as if she's being pulled down more than that she's just sort of floating down. And so to me, that always, again, really closely connects her with the materia that falls in that moment, which she's had all along, right? And it's just, it hasn't been something that could have been used or would have been suitable to use at any point, but which now, as she dies, is becomes out of reach. Her death. This is another thing. Like, just to look at it technically within the rules of the game, her death should not be final, right? There's no such thing as that. You die in battle, you get revived. It's not a thing. But in terms of the story, it's essential that she actually dies. You know, you see this, as you say, the descent to the underworld is something that you have to go through one way or another, it seems. And what that means mythologically, right, does seem to include among its most obvious meanings an encounter with death, right? An actual reckoning with the mortality that is the human's lot, right? And so that involves the attempt to descend, right? Makes a lot of sense. The way that the hero comes back out of that, right, is sort of in many ways what makes them heroic, what makes them unlike the common person or the incomplete person, right? Is that they return from that. They return from death, from the land of death, or how, the underworld, however you want to say it, right? And this is a classic thing, like going back to video game rules. Well, yeah, like you have lots of lives. That's how you get better at the game. You die over and over, and pretty soon you learn how to play the game, and then you don't die quite as much, but you still die a lot, and that's okay. And that's how it works in imagination, right? You can imagine playing through stories, and you might die in the story, or you might die in the drama, the play, but that's all right. That's almost like the whole point of being able to represent, is as a way to kind of reckon with that. And anyway, so just to go back to the water imagery, it's also super interesting that in this boss battle that happens, all of the attacks seem to be water type attacks, right? It's like the evil version of this medium is trying to bring you down. But you have an item that if you searched around it even a slight bit, you found the item that will make it impossible for you to lose this battle, right? Because it will always just heal you with its water attacks. So it really emphasizes like the dual aspect of death, of violence, in terms of story and how that works. And what you're saying about Sephiroth representing the cutting aspect of intellect, sort of self cutting aspect of it is super interesting. I think that dissent in free societies, that's part of what makes it so important, right? To cut away ideals that no longer are serving, and to allow the new ones to be born. That's a real interesting image, and it makes me think a lot about modern and contemporary kind of culture dissents and discussions and things.
Right, and like again, illustrating the point about him is he can do something that nobody else in the game can do, including you. He can permanently remove somebody in a way that you cannot fix. He has a superpower even over you, the player. He can take away anything you love too, by extension, because you can't even keep yourself together. But I also wanted to mention along that lines what Sephiroth does to you, which is also sort of an underworld thing, because when Achilles from the Iliad becomes enraged, he is called pitiless like the death god, because only the death god is pitiless because he takes all people. And so in some way, to be gripped by an emotion is to be possessed by a god, is to be sort of like a harbinger of death, or to be in the underworld and have your sort of decisions determined for you in the first place. And so, sorry, I'm trying to bridge that connection now, just having steeped into the Iliad so far and talked about Achilles. And this is a connection I did want to make. Oh yes. Well, so what you feel when Sephiroth does this, the first thing I felt when I first watched this ever, and when I watched it now, was unforgivable. That word just jumped into my head. It's like, finally he's done it. Everything he's done, destroying home, destroying mom, but now killing Ares too, that just is too close to home. It's too much, unforgivable. And what sort of took over me as a player, which I imagine you're supposed to think took over Cloud too, is like this iron resolve to kill Sephiroth. to destroy him, finally get vengeance. And that is itself a descent to the underworld and becoming determined and giving up the good of the logos or the intellect. And that is what Cloud is going to have to overcome that sort of hate, to let a new ideal be born, or something that will be powerful enough or holy enough to fight against the ultimate destructive materia, the blight from the skies, meteor, which hasn't been summoned yet, but I'm imagining it will happen soon.
Right. Like Sephiroth's removing that one obstacle, right? Aeris has the one thing that can save the planet. He cuts her down, and she seems to accept it, right? Like she doesn't raise a hand. She doesn't have the chance. It's like you can't believe. For me, it's like unbelievable. I can't believe, right? This is happening. This can't happen, right? Surely there's some mistake here, and that feeling that like the bottom just falls out. It lets you know that there is something deeper, though, right? You have to go through that feeling, and I think forgiveness is a really good way to come to understand that eventually. But for forgiveness to mean anything, it has to be a real struggle, right? And I think that faith is much the same way, right? To believe that there is like good that's going to come out of this evil thing, that should be extremely difficult if it's authentically like felt, and it really determines your actions in the world, and your choices that you make.
Well, it's the ultimate moral effort, right? Because Cloud is going to, if he actually wants to get this vengeance, which he now has the ultimate motivation to get, because not only is Sephiroth trying to destroy the world, it is both his fault, and Sephiroth has taken the most important person in the world away from him. And so he is the most motivated person on the planet to destroy Sephiroth, and as Sephiroth is the most powerful creature ever to have existed, Cloud is going to have to become even stronger than that. And so I think at the very least it's going to be an interesting narrative on what produces maximal adaptation to a situation. And it seems to be super motivation to achieve a goal results in maximum adaptation over the shortest amount of time, like the greatest increase in strength over time in order to achieve a goal. And so I don't know. I think that's sort of very interesting too. It's like if you set the bar high enough and you have a real reason to get over that bar, you'll probably, you'll find a way, or at least you'll be, die trying, I guess is the idea too.
It's interesting. Yeah. So thinking about it, like the way Nietzsche says it, right, is that Christianity has been this incredible tension in the bow. And so I'm thinking about like what Aeris does is set the bar, right, by dying. I mean, you could say that Sephiroth does it, and I think that, that is the simpler way to read the scene, right? Sephiroth takes away this thing. But I keep going back to, like, Aeris allows it to happen.
Right.
Like, whatever force of life is there allows this to happen. It sets that bar. It's the sacrifice, the sacrificial element that's so key there, that I think, that's sort of the counterpart to what you're saying about gaining strength as a result of that challenge, that gauntlet being thrown down, right? So in the one hand, you die trying, right? And that is what releases the energy for further trying and further striving. And so it's this kind of this cycle of effort.
You're right, because that's what Obi-Wan seems to have realized at the beginning of Star Wars: A New Hope, that if he allowed a good person to witness an injustice done, that would give the ultimate resolve. That would break the fairness circuit, right? Which we know is a fundamental motivation for humans. That when you see someone act unfairly, you want to punish the person who was unfair. And so that's what Obi-Wan realizes, that it will give Luke the ultimate resolve to defeat Darth Vader if he sees his master unjustly struck down in a defenseless way. And that seems to be also what's realized by Ares, that if she allows Sephiroth, who could kill her anyway, to do it willingly, in this sort of Christian voluntary sacrificial way. But so now she's both like Christ and like Mary, right? Because she's a feminine figure, but who gives life and tends to the garden, sort of an Eve-like way too, but also sacrifices herself for something greater than herself. Now she will give the motivation to Cloud necessary to possibly become strong enough to deal with Sephiroth himself. And so it's also like a story of Bildungsroman, right? That in sacrificing the ideal, she will make the actual being strong enough by striving for an even higher ideal to deal with a real world destructive conflict or a real world destructive force that rears its head over and over again and is possibly psychological in nature but has real world consequences. Sephiroth, who we're not sure because of his translucency to what extent he is real autonomously or relative to Cloud, because he does kind of talk inside your head and then appear out of nowhere, often where you are in moments of importance. And so what he is and in what manner he exists is very odd. And the fact that you keep fighting Jenova too, I find quite odd. But I would like to say that is I do think that is why this is such a pivotal scene. That what is done is so unfair. It's sort of like adolescents seeing like a crucifixion scene. I would say it's tantamount to that. It's the same sort of circuitry anyway. It's the same sort of story. And that it is supposed to evoke some of the most powerful emotions of vengeance in you. And that it does succeed in doing that, at least for me.
Yeah, just to throw another, I mean, I think you've made this connection, but to look at it another way, the opening of the Iliad, right, has to do with Achilles having a woman taken away from him.
Yes.
Right. And that's sort of the driving thing behind his rage, or an aspect of it, a way to think about it is just that. So yeah, I think, this seems to be really in line with those kinds of mythic descriptions, narratives that help us understand, or at least like see a kind of journey that we need to go through and sort of accept in order to save the world, right? So that seems to be and I'm thinking now of the way this game actually ends, which really throws an interesting spin on things, but I think we can deal with that when we come to it. But for now, I will say that one other really interesting thing about this moment is the materia that you find there in the Forbidden City, the comet materia.
Yeah.
It's like a miniature version of
Yes.
the meteor materia, right? Sorry, were you saying something?
No, I was just agreeing. I was saying, yes, it is just so funny that you put it that way, because that's exactly how I see it too, a miniature version of Meteor. Yeah, go on, please.
Yeah. And so that was just like a way to, again, sort of just like poke at the player and be like, now look at yourself, right? You're like a miniature Sephiroth. You've got your comet materia. Aren't you so proud? And you've got your fancy, you're getting some pretty fancy armor at this point. You've got your water ring, you've got your dragon armlet. You're pretty cool. You got your Aurora bangle or whatever it's called. So, your party is probably pretty strong at this point relative to a lot of the things you're fighting, especially if you've done some of the side quests and stuff like that, right? But again, it's like now all the more you feel that this great injustice is happening, that that Eris is taken away at this moment, and particularly, right, if you have invested some time maybe in like making her an important part of your party, if you're playing this game blind, which is practically impossible to conceive of at this point, but maybe you could, or you did at some point play it thinking that you'd have Eris the whole time, of course, right, naturally. And she's a great character, and maybe you might have even had a lot of important stuff equipped on her when she left your party, and that stuff is gone now. So it's down at the bottom of the lake.
it's interesting too because what you say there is she's the archetypal healer, right? Even most of her limit breaks center around healing. And so, again, even the fact that she dies is indicating that something is dying here, some archetypal role, something is being expanded. And I would be that our mentality has to be expanded about what a fantasy game is. And they really did do quite a bit in this game to expand, our ideas of fantasy. Like, it's a very sci-fi sort of game. But also so Ares dying. Oh, there was another point that was a part of that I really wanted to hit on that I thought was interesting. Let me see. Sorry about that. But yeah, no. So she's going to be upsetting normal roles. Sephiroth is going to be able to kill them in that way. No, that's all I've got for the moment. Sorry.
No, it's cool. I mean, I really appreciate just like thinking through this stuff because I always, have lots more ideas as we talk than, it's very easy to just be drawn into the story and play through, and that's fine. And that's, in one sense, like the right way to play the game, I think. But I do really like that we can kind of find, not too deeply buried there, like a whole lot of really interesting stuff. The sci-fi-ness is driven home a lot by the CGI itself, right? Like that's a new element of the technology that's being deployed here. And you notice the times when it's used, they all seem to really center around like critical points of contention, right? It's not really used for like beautiful sort of peaceful moments. It's like when you're on the motorbike, and it's when Sephiroth is burning down your hometown. And here, of course, the most famous, I think, maybe the most famous image in any video game. I don't know. Maybe that's a hyperbolic statement, but
it's not that
it's up there, right?
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
one. So the CGI, that whole like element of it, to me, it helps in some sense pull you into the story. But on the other hand, by comparison with the CGI graphics, the rest of the game, especially in hindsight of a couple decades here, it doesn't look that great, and so you really have to invest a lot as a player imaginatively to the world, which is something that I really actually like about it, right? You do, even if you're not thinking hard about the game, your mind is doing quite a bit to make it a kind of real experience for you. The game's weakness is part of its strength, which I think is kind of the theme here.
Well, two things there. I think part of what Sephiroth here represents, this is what I missed last time, was might be the meeting of parochial culture with larger national and multinational culture, that which has been important to you. Now you see how small it is in comparison to these sort of super entities. And so just as the game sort of pokes at your character and how weak it is compared to Sephiroth, this might be like sort of the weakness of your sort of like small parochial narrative in the wake of sort of national, multinational ones that are even represented in like large form in like sort of like through Star Wars, right? Which has a galactic alliance, which is the biggest possible community of sentient beings. And so that was something I wanted to mention about the game sort of poking at you. And then directly to your last point, what was the last bit that you just said, just so I can remember what it was I had to say? I just like store these things in the cloud.
Just about the weakness of some of the graphics with respect to CGI.
So I think that sort of illustrates, so this guy Peterson we talk about often cites these neuroscientists, and one that he talks about says that you don't see a cliff edge. You don't see like a definite thing that you then see the definition of. You see it as a place for action. You see it as a falling off place. You see it for what the implications for your behavior are. And so I think that a game really illustrates the truth of this, because you get the meaning of what's happening regardless of how it's portrayed in front of you. Just like sort of like how cartoons work. It could be South Park with terrible graphics, or some beautiful Hayao Miyazaki with wonderful ones, but you're still going to like laugh and cry, right, as you watch it. Because what you're actually seeing is the meaning or the drama or the tension of the situation, not the actual images themselves, which is almost like why when somebody walks in and they're like, those graphics suck, you just get defensive and angry and are like, whatever, they're good enough for me. And I think that that's actually what a lot of the arguments we had when we were young were about, right? Like, who had better graphics, N64 or Sony or PlayStation, even though it was like objectively true that the N64 did, but you would still argue about that because you were like, this one tells the better stories. I like it more. I don't care about the objective facts. And I think that's what you're sort of pointing to here.
Yeah. Oh, that's funny. Thinking about the kind of defensive nature of fandom. That's very interesting because I think in many ways it deeply misunderstands the thing it's trying to defend. Right.
Right.
Is kind of the outcome of that line of thinking. But on the other hand, the heart is in the right place, right? You want other people to like the stuff that you like. You want them to give it a fair chance. And maybe you're kind of blind to the fact that you aren't really being objective about it anymore yourself, right? So, yeah, I really like how seminal this moment is in people's game playing experience and in sort of the culture of gaming. I think I don't know enough about what has already been said about it. I don't really particularly care to do the research either. But I do really like that this moment in some ways like polarizes people on this game, either because they really love the game or they really despise people who love the game. There's all these different ways in which this happens, and I think what we're attempting to do here is to look at it not exactly objectively, of course, as you say, but to look at it as a story, right? And what kind of story is being told, and how does it relate to other stories which may have influenced it, or may, in what ways does it relate to the underlying mythological structures that seem to influence pretty much every story, right? And so the other aspect of it, though, of culture, in terms of Japanese culture, in terms of historical events, but also in terms of more modern and postmodern culture of the kind of discussions around this game. For people who are interested in that stuff, again, this is kind of the most crucial point to look at probably. I bet there's like sociological studies and psychological studies out there about this stuff. Now, at the next conversation we're going to do is going to kind of just dip a toe into that stuff, right? Around the idea of addiction. That is one that I'm looking forward to. That's in just the next couple of days here, right?
Yeah. So in the next couple of days, we are going to do that. We're going to have Dr. Matt Roos on, and we're really looking forward to that. He's been collaborating on Consilience Conversations, and he is a professional neuroscientist. So we're going to talk a little bit about what's happening when somebody gets addicted and how one can become addicted to sort of an activity, and how one is actually doing real activities and hardwiring oneself for those activities when one is playing video games, and just how sort of a narrative can produce seeking behavior in someone, which is highly which is that uses this neurotransmitter called dopamine, which gives one which is the best reward one can receive to pursue a certain end. And so that builds habit fastest. And so it's going to be, well, we're going to talk about just how nasty addiction is, and just how nasty addiction can be to a video game, and just how much nastier it is if you want to get to that next point in the narrative. So you're pretty motivated to get there, because I think it's something that catches a lot of people, and that they might be ashamed to admit, but that actually they shouldn't be ashamed, because a video game is like a super narrative, right? Not only is it the most gripping possible archetypes, where you even use more of your brain to interact with it, your two hands, which if you ever look at a motor homunculus, most of your what your motor strip in your brain represents you as is like a face and like two hands. And so you're actually using far more of your brain in order to be a part of this experience, which means that the habits you're building are even more in you for when you become addicted to a video game than for, something simple like even simpler than like reading or just listening to something. So yeah, it's going to be very, like all of our conversations, I think it will be very, very interesting.
I gotta say, after playing this part of the game, I did continue playing quite a bit more than I intended to. Like I went on and climbed the weird like ice cave thing, and so I saved the game outside up in the snowfields. And I'd intended to just save it after the story stuff got through, because I knew that's all we'd really have time to talk about today. But I kept playing anyway, and as you say that, I think I have to admit that the evidence would suggest that I am slightly addicted to this game now.
Well, I mean, and that is the risk, we take as sailors, right? As sort of like, like what a therapist would do with a client, and our client happens to be this highly addictive game, right? So it's like something that can be a normal personality or a neurosis and infect us to some extent as we're dealing with it and draw us in, but we have to navigate it sort of like through the Scylla and the Charybdis. But I just wanted to mention the fact that you first start in a cold ass place, going up a mountain is very purgatorial right after this, as if it is a place of limbo, a place of cold without the heat of the ideal behind you. It is itself also like a dead, barren desert place that after something dies, you find yourself in a terrible place where distinctions disappear, like the Jews from Egypt in Exodus into the desert, or like now you go out into the cold, you are beyond your old belief structure, and so you're going to have to rebuild it yourself. You are like the Grinch, Ron Howard's Grinch, running out from Whoville and now onto this mountain, which is cold. You're going to have to, like Zarathustra, and this is what I think Nietzsche gets wrong, not build your own values, but find the new superordinate value and thus build your sort of moral structures that enable you to get to or strive towards that value. But you're not there yet. You're out in the cold, basically. Mm-hmm. It's like a second expulsion. The first one was getting out of Midgar and getting to that world map, and now you're in this freezing place. And if I recall correctly, do you have to actually shiver to keep yourself warm? It's like that cold, right?
Yeah, that part hasn't happened just yet, but yeah, that is about to happen at some point here.
So, yeah.
The way in which the ideal is laid to rest, and the player continues on is also really strongly, like, this moment is marked out in terms of the game's technology as well, right? You have to take out disc 1 and put in disc 2, and there's this this moment during which you're playing the game, but there is no game in the device. It's a very interesting, and I think maybe another sort of new thing that happened with this game. I don't know. There may have been other games before this that had multiple discs and whatnot, but it's quite a scary experience, huh?
Yeah, well, you have to take a breath and then move forward. That's one thing. And you are showing and voluntarily choosing to move forward and accept the conditions that the game has placed on you, right? Just like Cloud has to accept conditions that life has placed on him now, that you're moving forward. But yeah, I think you're directly referencing the fact that I now have a PS3, and so I play this as a downloaded game I bought from Sony directly. And so, or from Squaresoft through the PS3 store or the Sony store. And so when the game asked me to move on to the next disc, I thought I might be stuck, just like I thought I might have been stuck when I was going against that last big boss that could deal so much damage. I forget which one it was. Oh yeah, it was on the Nibelheim Mountain, right? The one right before the wall, that dragon that was so tough. Yeah. And so I experienced another one of those dysregulating sort of Pandora's box opening and snakes jumping out, in my life becoming more complex, because I was like, oh no, what's going to happen if this is a flaw in the game, in the emulator, and I can't move forward. But luckily there was a FAQ about that where I just had to press the home screen and then I could change to the next disc. But I do agree that is a very interesting moment in the game, the taking a breath, and that itself being a part of the experience. And also sort of like you having to have faith in the game that it will work, that if you perform this operation where you shoot the disc out, it won't just restart on you. But it does also not test your faith too much because it lets you save before that moment.
Yeah. It's it sort of eases you into it. And it's not the last time you'll have to do this, right? This is a 3-disc game, but we're on to disc 2. We've got our first new guest coming up here to help lead us into this new chapter of the game. And it's, well, I mean, I guess a pretty good like 17 episodes, is it, of disc 1. So we're looking at like 40 or 50 episodes total for this series. I think that's pretty rad.
Yeah, I'm pretty excited about this because I used to consider, and it's interesting to what extent pursuing ideals helps you to shape higher ideals than the ones you first conceived. But I used to consider this like magnum opus level stuff, like that I thought at some point in my career I might be able to try and go through this. And I never even gave thought to the fact that I might be able to do it with a scholar like you. And now, I mean, we're much closer than a third of the way through this, because disc 3, from what I recall, is not actually that long. You can do a bunch of fun side quests, and often you can spend a lot of time like with the chocobos and stuff, but it's sort of light on the story. Like, I think it's only 5 or 10 hours of gameplay in the story. So we're actually a lot closer to halfway through the game than I think, and thus halfway through a project that I thought was going to come a lot later in my career and in our careers. And, this is just groundwork stuff at this point, which is interesting. So we're like that character Cloud, right? Like, obviously there's still people like Shapiro and Ruben and Peterson and all those IDW guys who we hope someday to be speaking to and on terms with, and, not just have them be like sort of figures above us, but be colleagues. But we're those are like the Sephiroths, and we're like, the Cloud. We're a lot farther along, much bigger listenership than we did, and we're accomplishing things much bigger than I think we ever hoped already. And I think we're far more understanding of what it is we're doing and what it is we're pursuing. But we ultimately see that there's just so much room for growth too. So just like my characters are level 35 and I know they can be level 100, I feel like that's sort of like us as well.
Oh, totally. Yeah, I mean, to try to aspire to talk to some public intellectuals and people who are really driving very interesting, controversial movements and things with this new technology, much like the game, there's a kind of risk on the one hand, right? Maybe you're wasting your time, who knows? But on the other hand, yeah, like each time we do one of these, we get to save the game. It's there. If this all explodes tomorrow, well, we made this portion of it, and that's out there somewhere. And like Faulkner says in his Nobel Prize speech, right? Somewhere down at the end of time, it'll just be a human voice talking, right? Something like that. So I think about that sometimes. It's an interesting way to bequeath something to posterity here, and it's been very enlightening and very fun to do so. Yep, looking forward to continuing on.
Yeah, and it's interesting to what extent articulating your past frees yourself from it. And so we've been doing things along sort of a Freudian level too, and it's interesting. I wonder to what extent at some point we might offer this as sort of a therapeutic service as well as just a leisurely service, because I think talking is always helpful when it is genuinely done about something which somebody cares about, often something personal to somebody. And it's interesting because I think one of the hangups about us ever talking about this game is that I used to think that it was too personal for me. And yet that's the opposite of how it should work, right? The more personal something is, the more you should talk about it in terms of articulating it in order to understand what its definite effect on you is, in order to release you from touchiness about that effect, but to understand the reality of the effect so you don't feel like you have to defend it, right? Because that's the problem when something touches somebody and they don't know how to articulate why. Somebody else will ask you why, you won't have a good answer, and then they'll dismiss it as if it doesn't exist. And since it's your experience, it's the most important thing to you in the world. You don't want to be gaslit, and so you'll get upset. And so I think these stories that are so close to us that we learned about at such formative parts of our lives, articulating what it is that they mean to us so much later in life, doesn't take away from our initial experiences, but it helps us to connect to other people and helps us to understand what sort of beings we actually are.
Oh, nice. Well said.
Yeah. Well, bang. I hope everybody listened in till the end today, because you never know when the gold's going to come out, right?
Yeah. Well, usually at the end of the battle, there will be a certain amount of gil, and then you can use that to go buy an HP plus materia and an MP plus materia, because those are pretty useful. And so anyway, all right. Thanks again. Till Tuesday, right?
Yeah, Tuesday. And so for those of you all listening, we've got another Harry Potter coming out with the wonderful Sarah Miller tomorrow. We've got this next side quest coming out on Tuesday. We'll set this down, but probably we're going to have a night school, I would imagine, on Wednesday. Wes.
Yep, sounds good.
Yeah, sounds good. And then Thursday, Friday, Saturday, we'll let you know as the week goes on. And our recurrent events either this week or next week as well. So, we're hitting our stride, and we're gonna take as many laps as we can.
Right on. All right. Well, thanks again.
Thank
you. Have a good one.
You too.